to the Continental Army, and some of these Virginia troops are then sent to join the main army, and Lee is one of them. That's really the beginning. That's things get going there, and he in the early years of the war. This is kind of a thing when you're talking about Lee later in life. He gets a generalship, and he's generally known in history as Major General Henry Lee or Light Horse Harry Lee, and people maybe draw the connections between Robert and Henry in terms of their military careers, but the legacies are quite different, because where Lee, the elder Lee, really made his mark in the Revolution was not big set battles. It was partisan warfare. These are soldiers that are fighting between the lines. They're raiding the British or the Hessians. They're fighting between battles. They're trying to secure supplies, trying to feed Washington's soldiers. So it's a lot of battles. Lee really makes his mark in a lot of battles we've never heard of. They don't even have names, really. And the one in particular where he really gets Washington's attention is something that's known as Scott's Farm. And it's actually during the winter where the army's at Valley Forge, and Lee's job is posted wandering in between Valley Forge and Philadelphia, which is occupied by the British at the time, fighting the British, raiding British supply trains. He's posted up at a farm called Scott's Farm in a house there. He's causing so much consternation amongst the British Army that 200 men, or 200 or so, are sent to find him and eliminate him. This rebel known as Lee, as he's called. And he's posted up with 7 or 8 other soldiers at the time, and they are caught by surprise, but Lee pushes all his men to the window. They somehow repulse this vastly superior in numbers British force and send them scurrying away. It's insignificant tactically, but it's this sums up Lee, this type of daring do, not afraid of any odds, and they're able to repulse this attack. When Washington hears about it, it's exciting. It injects it lifts the morale of the army at a time when morale is in short supply. These are the type of things that Lee built his reputation with, and that catches Washington's attention, helps that Washington would have already known who he was, and that there were familiar, powerful political connections in the Lee family.
Is this what made him a good cavalry officer, that this lack of impulse control that makes him such a financial wreck later in life happens to make him good on horseback?
Yeah, I think you could extrapolate. I think what it is, number one, is that there's a daring do. As I said, he's a swashbuckling character. It's really fun to read about, to hear about him through the letters and the contemporary correspondence, especially between Washington and the politicians in Philadelphia and Washington and other officers in the army. This is a very aggressive, fearless man, but he also is very good at improvising on the battlefield. That's another one of his big legacies, and you really get to that when you start talking about the Southern theater, when he's sent to help Nathanael Greene clear out the British from the Southern states. But I think you're right. I think that type of, jumping ahead a little bit, but when he left the army, Nathanael Greene sent him, and there was a series of really interesting letters back and forth between the two of them. And when he left the army, Nathanael Greene said to him, this is almost verbatim, he said, you're going to go home and you're going to marry and you're going to become a farmer, but you cannot cease to be a soldier. And I think what served Lee so well in wartime, those impulses and his instincts and his combative nature, are the same things that made it very difficult for him to adjust and succeed in peace.
What were some of his biggest accomplishments in the Revolutionary War?
Well, the signature accomplishment, at least in the Northern Theater, is the Battle of Paulus Hook, which was a loyalist-held military installation kind of jutting out of New Jersey. I think modern-day Jersey City was built over where Paulus Hook was. It was thought to be impregnable, generally. And Lee, I have to step back at one point. Lee did the reconnaissance work for a similar raid on a supposedly impregnable fort called Stony Point, which that raid was led by Anthony Wayne. It was successful. Lee and his men had no actual participation in the battle, And Wayne was the Continental Congress heaped approbation on Wayne, and I think it made Lee jealous, even though he and Wayne were friends. So he comes up with the idea then. By the way, there's something I just want to go back and say because I think it's really interesting and it's pertinent to this, is that after the incident at Scott's Farm, Washington asks Lee to join his inner circle, his administrative inner circle, which what that means is this is the group of young men who are handling Washington's correspondence, conveying messages for him. It's the equivalent. I don't know. It's like the equivalent of the choicest political job you could potentially have in terms of your future and your connections. It's safer. You're not as exposed to danger as Lee would have been otherwise, and you would have made these great connections. Alexander Hamilton, John Lawrence, two examples of many of young men who go in and out of that circle, and you're closer to the general at the time. Hamilton conveys this message to Lee that Washington asked him to join his administrative staff, and Lee says no thanks. And again, the letters are preserved. It's very fascinating. He says to Washington, it's a great honor. I'm flattered. It would do me and my family great honor, and would make secure my future because of connections. But my fame has to be earned on the battlefield. I'm wedded to my sword is the famous quote that he uses. And Washington, this just shows you the amount of respect he had for Lee, didn't bat an eye, and he simply says, carry on, think nothing of it, pretend we never had this conversation, and in the future I will try to find opportunities for you to meet your goals of fame and glory. So now we jump back forward to Paul's Hook, because Washington has said to Lee, I want to try and help you with this. They have an open line of communication, which I think would have been pretty rare between a soldier of Lee's rank and the general of the army. Lee proposes this raid on Paul's Hook, this supposedly impregnable fort. And after some back and forth and some planning, and Washington finally consents, and Lee leads the raid. It's not without some difficulties. Some of the soldiers get lost. It's a nighttime raid. They have to cross water, but they end up taking the fort without losing a single life. So a little bit of difficulty on the way back. Some boats that were meant to carry them back don't show up. There's some skirmishing with the British along the way, but it's a success, and Washington is thrilled. And it's another example of something, again, not tactically a particularly important achievement in the war, but it's another of these moments when the country is, maybe despondent over the future of this conflict, to see Lee go in there and take this fort that no one thought could be pried away from the British. It lifts the morale of the army and excites Washington, excites the Congress. That's really I think, one of his signature achievements. I should point out that he ends up being court-martialed immediately afterwards, because this is something that's very typical in the army. It's very typical during the Revolution. For lack of a better term, the army was full of divas. These men who were fretting over their reputation and not being properly acknowledged for their achievements, and looking at their peers and just frothing at the mouth because of jealousy. And that's exactly what happens with Paul's Hook. Several older soldiers are angry that Lee was given command. They are not happy that Lee's getting all the glory for this, and they press charges, and he ends up being court-martialed. All the charges are dismissed. Washington, of course, is on his side. But this leaves I would say, a scar in some ways, because you're dealing with a sensitive, ambitious, egotistical young man, and he has this great stroke of glory, and it's temporarily taken away from him by his peers. I think from the rest of the war on, you see him being nervous and jealously guarding his own reputation, and maybe by the end of his participation in the war, hearing phantoms, in terms of seeing phantoms, in terms of thinking there were other men out to get him, out to take away his due recognition in the war. So it's a great achievement for him, but I also think in some ways it's the beginning of his downfall in terms of his service during the Revolution.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. There's another moment of glory he has, and I think it's what helps him enter into the pantheon of founding fathers, and that's him leading Virginia to ratify the Constitution. So what role does he play in that, and what does that look like, him leading Virginia to do that?
After the war, he marries into his own family, marries his second cousin, that's Matilda Lee. Second cousin isn't exactly right. It's the daughter of his father's cousin. And by doing that, he ends up inheriting Stratford Hall, which is the Lee ancestral home on the northern neck in Virginia. And he begins a life as a planter and as a politician. He's intimately involved in politics. In the first years after the war, when the government is being run under the Articles of Confederation, he's in the Congress of the Confederation and sees, while he's there, this is not working. This is a dysfunction. There's no control. There's no organization, no ability to raise funds to support this government, support an army. And he actually corresponds with Washington quite a bit about this, about his frustrations when he's in New York for Congress. After the Constitution is conceived, he runs to be a delegate at the Constitutional Convention in Virginia. It's a whole host of really major players show up for this: Patrick Henry, George Mason, James Madison, among many others. And he goes there as a proponent of the Constitution and confers with Washington quite a bit beforehand. And his angle in this, it's really kind of the fight in Richmond is between kind of the old lions of Virginia and the young revolutionaries, the young upstarts. It's kind of George Mason and Patrick Henry, who were the established politicians and figures in the state, versus Lee and Madison and John Marshall, who were younger and pro-Constitution. And Lee tangles several times with Patrick Henry, which is pretty remarkable because Henry is a silver-tongued, formidable figure, and they go back and forth about the merits of the Constitution. One of the things that Henry is really not happy about is the idea of a standing army. And Lee is able to say, because he has an experience that Henry really doesn't have, he's able to say, I fought with militia and there's nothing wrong with them, but you cannot expect them to defend the country. I saw them fold at times in major battles at Guilford Courthouse, Utah Springs. So he's able to bring a set of experiences, even though he's younger by a couple decades than Henry, that give him an upper hand in this debate back and forth. But what's really striking, especially when you, not to always go back to Robert, but when you look at the future and you look at what Robert's place in history, is that one of the great arguments that Lee makes, and he makes it because he served in the army, I think, and because also, let's get back to his education in New Jersey. He would have been educated with other young men from all across the colonies. He kind of has a national perspective because of his education, because of his military service. And he says, I love my brothers from the North as much as I love my brothers from the South. We are one nation. And he says, in all local matters, I'll always be a Virginian, but when it comes to national matters, I'm an American, and I won't forget that. So he very eloquently makes the case, persuasive case, to ratify the Constitution in concert with Madison and others. He didn't do it single-handedly, but he played a part. And this is important because you need Virginia's buy-in. This is one of the biggest, wealthiest, most influential of the states. And without, even if it passes, even if it's ratified, which I think it ends up being, they don't need Virginia's vote in the end to ratify, but you want Virginia to sign on. Without it, the credibility of the Constitution is not quite the same. So this is a very, very important thing to be involved with, and Lee is involved with it, and they are successful. And obviously, the rest is, all the course of history. But just one little thing about the Constitutional Convention ratification in Richmond, I think the viewers will get a out of, is that there's a letter that I had a chance to read that is written by Madison to Hamilton, who's busy in New York with their ratifying Constitution at the time.